Sous vide got really popular for two reasons. One was really relevant to restaurant chefs, but over time it got to feel a little bit like stunt cooking. But it's not. It can be really useful to the home cook, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Sous vide allowed chefs to create dishes that hadn't been possible before. One really popular one was this, the 72-hour short rib. These are short ribs that have been cooked for 3 whole days. And then before serving, rather than getting seared in a skillet, chefs preserve that perfectly uniform interior by hitting the ribs with a blowtorch. These bright pink short ribs have the texture of a medium rare steak, but a lot more marbling in flavor. In fact, if I've done this right, I should be able to just cut it with this fork. It was kind of miraculous. Everyone wanted to try this. For a steak that's just got salt on it, no sauce, no spices, it's amazing. So short ribs are typically served well done because you have to cook them for a long time for them to become tender. But sous vide allowed chefs to make something new, and diners flocked to restaurants to try things like this. The other reason it got popular was it saved chefs time and money. Sous vide let them cook all sorts of meat to the perfect temp. Their cooks just needed to brown the outside and then get the food onto a plate. That is so much faster and easier than teaching a cook how to cook something so that the inside gets to the proper temperature at the same time that the outside is perfectly seared. Customers got perfect food, things weren't sent back, and everybody's job got a lot easier. This second point, the foolproof side of sous vide, that's what I love about it. Meat is really expensive right now, and being able to prepare it without fear of getting the cook wrong is such a relief. Or maybe you're cooking for a crowd. Knowing that all you have to do is get the outside seared properly because the meat is already perfectly seasoned and cooked, it makes entertaining so much simpler and less stressful. Besides the immersion circulator itself, you're going to need a container to hold the water and the food, some sort of bag to put the food in, and something to cover that container. Hop onto the ATK app and search immersion circulator for our review of these appliances. I've got a couple of ribeyes here that I'll use for this demo, but I'm going to keep the discussion broad because this method can be used for so many different types of meat. So when it comes to the container, the biggest consideration is how much food are you cooking? You need something that's big enough to hold all the food and the water that surrounds it. Smaller considerations are how hot is the water going to be and how long is the cook time. A good recipe will do all of this work for you, but if you're scaling a recipe or experimenting, then remember, the higher the temperature and the longer the cook, the more evaporation is possible, and so the more water you'll need to account for that. Or just a really good lid. So for these steaks and for most projects, a Dutch oven or a Cambro is a great container. Or if you do this a lot, maybe you want to invest in a dedicated sous vide container. And for a lid, you don't need anything fancy. Plastic wrap works great. Generally, you want to fill the bath so that the food is fully submerged, but that the water doesn't exceed the max fill for your circulator. As for the water temperature, you usually want to set it to whatever the serving temperature is. When we cook a steak, we remove it from the heat at 125 degrees for medium rare. That's not the serving temp. As it rests, that steak continues to cook for a couple of minutes, and the internal temperature, it usually goes up 3, maybe 5 degrees. So we want to set our water bath to somewhere between 128 to 130 degrees. I'm taking these to medium rare, so I'm going to use 130 today. These are the other numbers you need to know. Finally, you need a bag for the food. A sturdy Ziploc bag like this one, it's going to be great. But before we get to that, we need to get these steaks ready for bagging. So I'm just going to season these ribeyes before putting them in the bag. Now, one of the nice things about cooking sous vide is you don't have to salt your steak hours in advance. When we salt a steak and let it sit, we're giving the sodium ions time to move into and season the meat. Sous vide cooking, though, it can take hours, and that's plenty of time for those sodium ions to move in while the steak cooks. We're also giving the chloride ions time to work too. Remember, salt is a molecule that's made up of 2 ions, sodium and chloride. Chloride helps the proteins not contract as tightly when they're heated, and that keeps the meat juicy. This is really important if you're roasting or searing or grilling because all of those methods bombard the surface of the meat with heat for minutes to hours. And that means that any proteins within 1/4 to 1/2 inch of the surface, they're going to be kind of wrung out and a little bit dry. Sous vide doesn't do that because the water temperature is comparatively low. So food cooked sous vide stays much juicier and it doesn't need the help of the chloride. Okay, now that the steak is seasoned, we're ready to cook. You might find some recipes that have you sear the meat before and after bagging, but I prefer searing just once, after. It goes faster, and because the meat doesn't get exposed to high heat twice, there's less overcooking at the surface. When I use zipper lock bags, I like to open them up and then I like to cuff them like this. This keeps any stray bits of fat or oil or pepper from getting stuck in that groove, which is gonna really make sealing it a lot harder than it needs to be. And then we just drop the steak in the bag. Now, the steak isn't the only thing that belongs in the bag. You can add other herbs or maybe some shallot or garlic powder. I'm gonna use thyme, and I think 2 sprigs is plenty. You definitely do not want to use raw garlic, whether it's smashed, cloves, whatever. It's a potential source of botulism. We don't worry about botulism most of the time in the kitchen because it can only thrive in an anaerobic environment, and that's pretty rare. Sous vide is one of the few exceptions. So garlic powder is a much better choice. It's been heat treated, so it's safe. I'm not using it today, but if I were, I would just sprinkle a little bit, maybe half a teaspoon over this steak, kind of the way you'd sprinkle salt over the steak. Last up, we need oil. About a tablespoon, maybe even 2. Oil does a couple of things for us. It keeps the food from sticking to the bag. It also helps to distribute flavor. So you can see that the thyme is just hanging out right up here. If I didn't have any fat in that bag, really it would just be this area of the steak that picks up that flavor. But because so many of those thyme flavors are fat soluble, they're going to diffuse into that oil, and the oil fully surrounds the food and flavors it. Last thing, the oil is going to help us get all the air out of the bag, and that's really important. So why is air bad? Think about it like this. If you wanted to cook a potato as fast as possible and your choices are a 212-degree oven or a pot of boiling water, and remember, water boils at 212, which are you going to choose? You're going to boil that potato, right? It's going to go so much faster in the pot because water is great at conducting heat and air is terrible at it. So if you've got air in the bag and it's between the food and the water, then the food is going to cook more slowly and unevenly. If you sous vide a lot, you might want to invest in a vacuum sealer to get the air out, but it's not necessary. Here's how to do it with a zipper lock bag. You just need your tub of water, and when you seal this bag up, get as much air out of it as you can. There's some in there, but that's okay. So you want to lower it kind of slowly, and as you're lowering it, the water's going to press that plastic bag up against the steak itself and force the air towards the top. So if you go slowly and then open up a tiny corner, you don't want to open up the whole thing because if something slips, then you're going to get water in that bag. And then keep working the bag down slowly and letting the air work its way up. Now, this method isn't as perfect as vacuum sealing, but as you move the seal towards the water level, you should be able to work out pretty much most of the air. And then you just seal it back up. So I'm going to clip this here and we'll do another bag. So I like to clip these bags to the sides of the container to make sure that the seal stays above water. If I'm using a vacuum sealer, I just drop them right in. So the only thing to remember is that for your food to cook evenly, the water has to circulate around it evenly. So if you have multiple bags in one bath, you got to make sure they're not stacked one on top of the other. And if you have multiple items in one bag, make sure they're spread out in an even layer. Now we're just waiting till this is fully cooked. And here is where sous vide really shines. You know how conventional cooking means that you have to pay attention towards the end of the cook time because if you don't, you have to live with overcooked meat? And on top of that, you need to make sure that the outside is properly browned at the same time. Sous vide is great because it separates those two steps entirely. Recipes for sous vide take into account how long it takes the meat to get to the temperature of the bath and how long it takes for the meat to get tender at that temperature. Here's the thing though, the meat can't get hotter than the water in the bath, so it's not going to overcook. This steak can hang out in this bath after it's done for about an hour, and you can get other things done. Conventional cooking methods like searing or roasting or grilling, they can't offer you that flexibility. That's why sous vide recipes don't list a single cook time for the food. Instead, you'll see a range, say 1 to 2 hours or 14 to 16 hours. Within that window, the food's going to be perfect. If it stays in the bath too long though, it's not that it'll overcook, but the texture's gonna suffer. Meat and fish become mushy, eggs get too firm, and some vegetables lose their color and get really floppy. So once the meat is cooked and you're ready to serve it, the final step is to sear so that you can get that beautiful brown crust and those great flavors and aromas from Maillard browning. Since the interior is at the perfect temp, the searing step, it's really quick and easy. Just take the meat out of the bag, and by the way, you want to save those juices. Once the steak's out of the bag, pat the surface dry. Any water that remains on the surface of the steak is going to splatter when we go to sear, and so the drier that steak, the less messy the sear. Now we need just a smidge of oil, and once that pan's hot, we sear. Searing doesn't just improve the appearance and flavor, it also kills any microbes. After you've seared the first side and flipped the steak, you can chuck some butter in the pan and baste. This is a really nice way to get heat on the sides of the steak really easily. Or you can just use your tongs to give those sides a quick sear. When the steak is browned on all sides, it's done. Remember how I said you should save the bag of juices after the steak came out? Those juices are full of delicious flavor and they're perfect for making a pan sauce. There's nothing really tricky here. We're going to follow the usual pan sauce protocol. I want to leave just a little fat in the pan, less than a tablespoon, and then add some minced shallot. It's going to saute gently, and then I'm going to add minced herbs. I used thyme in the bag this time around, so this is minced thyme that I'm adding. I want to give that maybe 15 seconds of cooking before I deglaze with some red wine. And then, instead of adding the broth, I'm going to add the juices. So I like to do this by holding up the bag and just snipping the bottom corner, not enough that any of the plastic falls in the pan, just enough to release those juices. Then, once all the juices have kind of streamed through, I'll give the bag a pinch when the fat starts to come through. It's totally okay if a little bit of fat gets in the pan, you just don't want all of it. Now we're just going to let this come up to a simmer. Once it's reduced, I whisk in cold butter just as I would for any normal pan sauce, check the seasoning, and then it's done. There's something so satisfying about sous vide steak. It's so easy, and if you take a peek, the cook on this is just perfect. It's that edge to edge pink that everyone talks about and people go for, and sous vide is like the one way where you can absolutely get it. I can't wait to try this. Wow, the marbling on this is ridiculous. This is incredibly tender. It eats almost like a filet mignon, except because of all that marbling that ribeyes have, it's so much beefier tasting. It's fantastic. And this pan sauce, really awesome considering we just needed, a splash of wine and some aromatics. If you want more info on sous vide cooking so that you can experiment at home, or if you want just some really well-tested recipes, get yourself a copy of Sous Vide for Everybody. It's a great resource. Did I miss anything? What's your favorite thing to cook sous vide? Let me know in the comments.